everyone, this is Dave. Welcome back to another video. Thank you for tuning in as always. So this past week, Rocket Lab executives spoke at 3 separate investor events, actually. There was the B of A and Global Industrial Conference on the 18th. That was a VP of Finance who spoke there. As well, on the 17th, there was the 37th Annual Roth Conference. Peter Beck spoke at that one. And then back on the 4th, we had the KeyBank Emerging Technology Summit, and CFO Adam Spice spoke at that one. So as we get these events and new comments from Rocket Lab executives, I like to go over them and share the highlights as well as my high-level thoughts. Inevitably, these are very long videos, especially because we have 3 separate recordings to go over and bring you the highlights of. So hope you're ready for a longer one here today. But I think there was some pretty interesting stuff shared, as well as about new topics like Flatlight, as well as the Minaric acquisition. So it's not always just the same old. Before we do dive into that, if you are new here, I do hope you'll consider subscribing by the end of the video, because every new subscriber is so helpful for the continued growth of the channel. And if you aren't new here, thank you so much for the continued support, as well as especially big shout out to my channel members for what you guys do. Oh, and I'd also just like to go ahead and thank our newest channel member, Chris Bottix. Chris, thank you for the support. Much appreciated. Oh, and by the way, not really the topic of today's video, but we just got an announcement that Rocket Lab will have another launch coming up in very short order, and this is one hell of a cadence for a Q1 especially. Usually those are lighter quarters, but we're looking at now 5 launches for Q1, something I'm very excited about. 5 launches per quarter does put them at a rate of 20 launches per year, and Q1, as I said, usually a lighter quarter, so I think that bodes extremely well for Electron, crossing our fingers, but pretty excited about the cadence we're seeing from Electron right now, so figured I'd just mention that. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into Rocket Lab's conference updates.
But although you point out that it's a new rocket, the magic recipe remains the same. And yep, it's a new launch pad, and instead of pouring 10 tons of concrete for the launch pad, we're pouring 200 tons of concrete. Instead of being a 2-inch valve, it's a 12-inch valve. So yes, it's different, but honestly, it feels the same. And for me personally, having led one rocket program through to scale and now doing the second one, like a lot of this stuff just feels exactly the same, except with the foresight and the war wounds of screwing it up a few times along the way previously, that it feels pretty good.
That actually feels pretty comforting to hear. You think of Neutron as a completely new product, like way bigger than Electron, but I guess at the end of the day, as he said, if you scale up the numbers, at a 0, you get 1-inch versus 10-inch parts or whatever. He sounds very confident to me, and it's good to hear.
It's all happening so quickly, and you said you didn't want to take customers till you had confidence in the program, but now you have an inaugural customer ahead of the first launch. How does what's going to happen with the first launch this year and then maybe 3 launches next year, how does that transition to feeling like the Electron revenue model of launch? It's not going to happen immediately, so maybe just give us that pathway.
Yeah, and I think anybody who would sit up here and say we're going to go 1 and then 10 and 20 is just disingenuous, because that's just not the way it works. Like there's always a level of iteration and improvement as you go along the way. And when we were very, very, like we could have sold a whole bunch of Neutron launch at dirt prices, and because it's a brand new rocket, nobody's going to pay full price. So we waited until we had enough proof points and there's enough tension in the market that we could start selling at what we classified as normal prices. So we'll continue to do that, and as a result, as you point out, it's like 135 is the launch cadence, and that creates a lot of tension around those slots. So, which is exactly where we want to be, rather than hocking them off dirt cheap.
Okay. You say
Reminds me a lot of Relativity, and in a way, it's just like the exact opposite of their strategy, right? They just signed all sorts of contracts for quite cheap prices. What's happened now? Their old CEO has had to step down. They've had to bring in a new billionaire with new funding. So I think in a lot of ways, Rocket Lab's strategy has been proven out here.
but not in a way that is just kind of desperate in the fact that we'll just pick up anything, in a very disciplined way where the companies that we acquired are companies that we knew had to have the right culture to integrate to within us. And then some things that we just weren't happy with. There was, from a perspective of either the technology wasn't there, or there was no good companies to buy, or the culture of the company weren't going to integrate. And in those instances, we just went out and vertically integrated and created our own solutions. So
nice to get a little bit of background on why they decide to vertically, organically build out their own solutions in some situations. I think about the Hall effect thruster, where they're kind of secretly working on building their own, but we've seen job postings for roles where they're working on it versus obviously Minaric or a lot of these others where they go out and buy it. I guess they just don't like the fit of the companies that are available, but probably takes a bit longer to build something from scratch internally.
Yep. I mean, it's unfortunate. We do have a number of great suppliers, but we have more poor suppliers and we do have great suppliers. And this is literally the tyranny of the space industry.
Yeah.
Always late, always slow, it's just a real challenge. So when we meet those sort of challenges, we're not ones that just sort of throw our arms up and go, oh well, the wall's gone up. No, we literally will find a way around it, and whether it's doing something completely different with transportation or with technology, then no matter what it is, we'll always find a way around.
Well, it's pretty clear to me if we.
Interesting to get a little bit more background on the delays and the reasoning behind them. I was kind of the opinion that maybe it was more propulsion based on Archimedes, but it sounds like they had some suppliers not delivering parts for their structures. I think we'll get a little bit more info on that actually in one of the later talks, so stay tuned for that.
The U.S. Space Force and all, watching the SDA program, has been concerned that the optical comms weren't tested sufficiently as they did their first wave, and you guys introduced quickly an effort to buy Minaric out of bankruptcy. So maybe you can just kind of draw a line there of what's going on in terms of quality control and your effort to control the components to make things happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at the SDA platform as a good example, there's plenty of others. Optical comms have just been an absolute nightmare within the industry. Like it's a very, very hard technology. There's very few people who can do it and do it well. And then it's well canvassed that Minaric really had challenges in production scaling. And which is just the story of the space industry. And that's where we're really good. I mean, we did exactly the same with Sinclair. When we bought that reaction wheel company, we took it from 150 wheels to like thousands of wheels a year. So when it comes to like taking these deeply complex space components, we have a really well trodden path and systems and team that can really go in there and sort this kind of scaling out. And that's our intentions there as well. Because that has to be solved for the national security of the nation. That has to be solved.
Right, it's a critical path. They actually want to have GEO and LEO and MEO satellites all talking to each other, so that's a critical part. So how heavy a lift do you think Minaric is? I know you haven't acquired it formally yet, but you've done diligence on it. I mean,
yeah, well, we'll see. But I mean, like I say, it's been publicly canvassed that they have challenges with production. We're good at production, so I think we'll be okay.
Okay, so you think it's more of a production issue than a design issue?
I mean, we have...
All things being equal.
We have selected them for our platforms.
Right.
So
you ran them through.
So we only put the best stuff on our gear.
No, that manufacturing execution you can handle on. And then...
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'd like to hear that on Minaric. Obviously, the deal's not closed as of yet, but just the confidence I'm hearing in terms of getting their scaling and production issues sorted out, and the confidence that the product and the technology is good and top notch, but it's only a matter of scaling those production levels basically. So at least the foundational technology at least is very solid, and Rocket Lab's confident in their ability to be able to scale it because they've
just to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, we've methodically been building out various capabilities. There's not a single spacecraft program that isn't strategic for us, whether it be re-entering capsules of pharmaceuticals that builds our capability to actually know how to do re-entry for human spaceflight in the future, through to the MDA Global Star constellation in what they're doing there with their end customer. So everything has always been very
They're in customer direct to sell Apple. So I think that's an important point to remember, that Rocket Lab very deliberately went and got a contract to actually build some direct to sell satellites, or at least the buses of them. So yeah, important point to keep in mind there.
Very strategic in that sense. And I guess, the Flatlight is really just the next evolution in what spacecraft and are going to look like. But the unique thing about that is, those pancake kind of based spacecraft are really holding the hands of a rocket. Like it's almost impossible to kind of build one of those flat pack satellites and kind of ignore the rocket because they're very, very closely coupled. And the biggest design issue there is the first mode fundamental frequency, which sounds technical, but it's basically how flappy it is. And how flappy it is on the way up drives everything. The single stiffness mode drives everything. And that's why if you take like a Starlink satellite and tried to fly it under another rocket, they would all just arrive there as like a bundle of gravel. So it's very much tuned to the rocket, and the rocket is very much tuned to it, and that provides a very unique capability.
That's an interesting one. So I never had any doubt that they were tailoring Flatlight for Neutron, and kind of vice versa even. But I always kind of figured if they wanted to, they could sell Flatlights to someone who could then launch on a Vulcan, a Falcon 9, and Terran R one day maybe, or something else. But sounds like it's a little bit more difficult than that. And really, if someone's buying Flatlights, they're most likely going to launch on a Neutron. So do you think that's good because it will drive even more Neutron demand and kind of the vertical integration piece? Or do you think that's bad because if someone wants to use another launch vehicle, they're not going to buy Flatlights? Let me know down in the comments below.
I think the pairing that I should be asking about is Neutron and Flatlight has some superior design advantage over Falcon 9 and Starlink, and maybe you can enlighten us as to what that advantage is.
I wouldn't say it's a superior design advantage, but I would say that you have to couple both of those together to be successful. And having your own rocket and having your own ability to build satellites is, okay, there will be two companies in the world that can do that now.
I see. So it'll be hard for a third party who's just doing a constellation of satellites to put up a Starlink as easily.
I think it would be very, very difficult from an economic standpoint to be kind of cost competitive.
That's hard to see from the outside. So I guess someone like a Amazon Kuiper needs Blue Origin to succeed, I guess.
No, I mean, they've taken a different approach. They've got a different architecture, right? They have probably better capital reserves than others and longer time horizons. I think, if you're an emerging company or don't have the heft of an Amazon behind you, you think about things a little bit differently.
Well, we'll watch this.
It's hard not to think about AST there in terms of competing with Starlink while not having the launch piece, and Peter thinking in the future that it'll be very difficult to do that. Let me know what you guys think about that. I think AST, short term, their tech, it looks to be a lot better than Starlink. They need a lot less satellites to fill out their constellation. Obviously, those satellites are a lot bigger with the larger antennas and can reach more phones. So short term, I think AST has a lot of advantages, including all those partnerships with mobile MOUs. But long term, what's to stop SpaceX from building bigger satellites themselves and being able to launch them cheaper at cost? I think it's more of a long-term advantage personally.
Yeah. So the question was direct mobile device. Do we see this as being a big market that either exists or we might get into? And I think I'm not exactly sure, to be honest with you. It looks big. It looks interesting. But I guess the proof point has not occurred yet. There's no active service today. But when I think about it, just kind of fundamentally, there's a bunch of times, man, that I wish my call didn't drop, and there's a bunch of times where I wish I could be surfing the internet. And so I think the demand, the use case for the demand is there. Now, how big will it be? I think the jury's still out.
It's worth noting, just like wireless infrastructure, there's consumer, and then there's kind of industrial grade.
And defense.
And those need higher performance requirements,
yeah.
right? So maybe that's more of a market that would be
Yeah.
nearer term appropriate for Rocket Lab, right? I mean, as you kind of go into that, with consumer maybe coming after that.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly, like I say, it certainly looks big from the outside, but I think we're yet to see some of the proof points.
So interesting talk there around direct to cell phone connectivity. Obviously, as I said previously, they kind of have worked on some of those buses for Globalstar. And the fact that he just said, yeah, straight up, I'm not too sure yet if we're going to go into that at some point or not. I found that very interesting and kind of refreshing, to be honest. Obviously, a lot of people are putting a lot of money into it, and it does seem like the market and demand will be there. But the last piece about perhaps something for government and defense specifically could work very well for Rocket Lab, where it's like a separate network that is completely, disconnected from, Starlink, the wider internet, whatever, and secure in that point of view, and providing connectivity for, say, the military, could be something, right up Rocket Lab's neck of the woods that would make a lot of sense. Just throwing that out there as an idea.
And then back in the States, I look at medium-class launch vehicles, and there's a bunch of medium-class launch vehicles, trying to get to the pad. And at the risk of sounding arrogant, it's one thing to put a vehicle on the pad. It's a whole other thing to just do it over and over and over again. And that is so tremendously more difficult. And so I think it's almost a winner take all in some respects. If you're a small launcher, it's very, very difficult to now go and compete with Electron. Likewise, if you're a medium-class launcher, I think that window's about to close, because once Neutron goes onto the pad, we build a flight cadence on that quickly, what impetus does a customer have to take a whole bunch of risk on a new platform? And you've got a choice of two companies that have shown that they can scale and shown that they can be reliable. There's no other company out there that's showing those things. So I think there's a long-winded way to answer your question. Is I don't think there will be many. And furthermore, I think when you integrate spacecraft with launch, it's just such a powerful position to be able to deliver services or capabilities to customers. When you can combine both the launch and the satellite together, it becomes even more challenging to kind of compete just on a pure launch element. Because I tell you now, customers coming to us, and there's customers that say, yep, we want a launch, and that's great. But I would say the more interesting and the large amount of discussions we're having are, we want this capability, we want this service. We've got a cost per satellite that we want to meet, and can you build the satellite, launch the satellite, operate the satellite? Because we don't want to do any of that. We just want the service, and that's where it's all going. If you're just a pure launch company, my hat's off to you. That is a tough place to be in the future.
Wow. That's an interesting one. I would say that sounds incredibly bearish for, well, of course, relativity, also ULA, and to some extent, at least, Blue Origin has started to, expand beyond just launch, but they're still very heavy on, basically New Glenn. So that's interesting. But the market for new launch vehicles is kind of closing rapidly, in his opinion. Basically, as soon as Neutron gets going, he doesn't see a lot of customer reasons why they would want to go with someone else. So doesn't see too many different, medium launch vehicles ultimately operating. It could be scary out there for certain companies. Let me know what you think about that.
And you continue to see us pick off little piece by little piece, and announcement by announcement, and hardware by hardware, and success by success. Whether it's the Kiwi in me or not, I don't know, but you're never going to see some big grandiose announcement with arms waving everywhere. We'll just methodically execute and put one foot in front of the other, and we'll never put the company in a position where we're going to bet it. On a particular application or a particular thing, we'll just methodically go about it and create value all the way along.
I think just to state the obvious,
That was interesting. Obviously, a little bit different philosophy from SpaceX there, who often has big arm waving events and will bet the company on specific things. Like, even to the massive amount of success they had to date, we had posts online from Elon not that long ago saying the entire company would be at risk because Raptor was not scaling well and they needed Starship for Starlink. And with Starlink, if Starlink was not successful, the whole company was at risk. So a very different philosophy. I guess that is good to hear in terms of, you're not going to have to worry about them betting the whole company on one shot that may not connect. That is pretty much it for Peter at that Roth conference, but we do have two others, so let's go to those next. Okay, next up we have the B of A Global Industrials Conference with Rocket Lab VP of Finance, Stephen and Mamius. I hope I pronounced that right. Let's take a listen to this one, see what we can learn.
When you're first starting out, you have to make that trade-off between how quickly do you want to get things in versus vertical integration. A lot of the equipment that's required to build the composite structures, the lead time on this equipment is 1 year to 2 years long. So we can't wait until the equipment comes in to get the prototyping started and waiting for delivery, or we would never, we'd be much later than the schedule that we're on. The other consideration is in many cases we want to see technology like demos of our design, so we can make sure that the design is working as expected before we make the significant investment in capital equipment. The downside to that is you're relying on third parties to hit their schedules. And so we're susceptible to any slips that they have, it works into our schedule. And so the engineers are constantly working on ways to mitigate those risks, to bring if the schedule's pushing out, let's figure out ways to bring the schedule back in. In some cases, we've actually moved some of that composite structure from outside third parties already internally to the equipment that has been delivered that was not expected to be used until like the second flight. So we're already making those decisions now. But then lastly, the infrastructure.
Yes, that's fascinating. I kind of said it in the previous one that I thought maybe Archimedes was causing more of the issues, but sounds like a lot of it is structure related. And yeah, it makes perfect sense that you kind of want to see your design validated before you set up your entire production line and have all your equipment going to kind of roll them off the factory line one after the other. So maybe they just buy some of these structures one off, make sure it works as they intend, and then they would get their whole production line with expensive manufacturing equipment going. But yeah, so it sounds like some of these third-party vendors providing these first pieces for that initial Neutron caused a bit of a delay here.
The building a launch pad, there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into this. And it's a lot like building a house where you spend 80% of the time building everything that you can't see. And then as you get towards the end, then you start building everything above the ground. And that's exactly the way it's working with the Launch Complex 3, which is where Neutron will launch out of Wallops, Virginia. So in fact, things are progressing very, very well on that front. We are going to be having our grand opening of the launch facility in the May-June timeframe. So again,
that's very soon, by the way, May, June, that's a couple months out. So yeah, sounds like we can be quite confident about the launch infrastructure side of things being ready for that second half of the year launch. We're just looking now more towards the structure getting all together, and then obviously Archimedes being qualified for flight.
fair to think that the composite piece is probably the one that like keeps you up at night. And then on the other ones, you could actually start like managing that on your side most.
I think that's the piece that's given us the most challenge to date. I think the challenge with any rocket program is you don't know something's going to go wrong until it happens, right? And so right now, based on, I mean, everything is progressing the way it should, and we're confident until we're not, right? And if something happens, then we'll have to deal with that.
Yeah, I didn't expect the composite structures would be the showstopper and the one holding things up. So yeah, interesting to hear some of that information for sure.
No, that's a great question. So, Pete often talks about how he will never do that again, right? And you're right. When you have an untested vehicle, customers automatically expect there to be a pretty significant discount. And our view is that we have a tremendous amount of heritage that we're pulling from the Electron rocket. We know what we're doing. So we're not looking to provide discounts to sell our capacity, right? And I mean, by the way, the other consideration is that our stated cadence that we expect is the first test launch here in the second half of this year, ramping to 3 commercial launches in 26 and then 5 in 27. So there's not a ton of capacity, over the next few years. And so we have to be very careful on what customers that we're partnering with, because they may not show up at the pad, right? And so, both sides are kind of staring at each other, and saying, okay, are you going to be ready? Are you going to be ready? And so, so it's a very...
It's an interesting point I think a lot of us don't think about very much is everyone's like, okay, when are we selling Neutron contracts? When are we selling them? We need them sold. But at the end of the day, let's say Rocket Lab sells a big Neutron contract for a customer that they expect to be in 2027. Let's say they sell 5 launches in 27 to one customer. Then that customer is not ready. That really sucks for Rocket Lab, right? Because that's a lot of revenue they were expecting to get in 2027, and they need the customer to be there as well. So they need to not only make sure that the customer is real and can pay, but will actually be there on time. And you don't want to have 5 rockets ready to launch, but the customer is all of a sudden not ready. That's kind of a really bad scenario to be in as well. So it's not just about the sales, but it's selling to the right people who are actually going to be ready on time, and they can actually get paid on time and realize that revenue.
And then switching gears to Electron, how large is the backlog? How the pricing of that backlog looks compared to the ones that you have been recognizing so far? And how should we expect the cadence of Electron launches in the next couple of years?
So the backlog for Electron is over or nearly $400 million. So it's a pretty healthy backlog of launches. About half of that is over the next 12 months. And then the other half obviously is beyond 12 months. The price.
That's interesting for a few reasons here. Yeah. Okay. So a couple things. First of all, Rocket Lab said they expect to realize 50% of their backlog over the next 12 months. But doing my work on my spreadsheets, I didn't necessarily think that meant 50% of Electron's backlog would be recognized in the next 12 months. Maybe it's like 60% on space systems and only like 30% on launch or something like that. But if he's saying 50% of Electron's backlog is in the next 12 months, that gives us some good information on how many launches to expect. Again, obviously, customers not always ready, but $400 million, around $8 million per launch. We're talking about 24, 25 launches, which would be great if so, and would kind of line up with a lot of the other numbers they have talked about. On the other hand, the reason I was a little confused here is because if you say we have $400 million in Electron backlog, basically $500 million of the backlog is the big SDA contract. And the total backlog is a little over 1 billion. That just seems to leave like only 100 million for basically components and everything else. And something seems a little wonky there, unless my quick math I'm doing off the top of my head is off, because between, say, Globalstar, Solero, obviously the reaction wheels we keep seeing, that sounds like a lot more than 100 million. So I don't know. Something seems a little off. Maybe they've already realized some revenue on that SDA deal, but yeah, that's an odd one. Anyway, initial takeaway from that is they seem to be projecting something like 24, 25 launches over the next 12 months of Electron.
So we have a small yet very effective team in DC that engages with Capitol Hill and other parts of the federal government. On the Hill specifically, we have great relationships with some key committees, such as the Appropriations Committee and the like Armed Services. And we also have a tremendous amount of support from our congressional members. So Rocket Lab is based in 6 states throughout the country, and so we have a tremendous amount of support from our congressional members. And to be honest, it goes beyond our own congressional members within the states. I mean, other congressional members and their staff, they're all very supportive of adding more competition to the launch and just space in general. So again, it's very positive for Rocket Lab.
Yeah, it is interesting now. Rocket Lab's starting to get to the size where they do kind of have to worry about decisions being made by government and kind of advocating for themselves, and having that presence on Capitol Hill. Sounds like their team there is still quite small. I'm sure you look at the legal and I'm sure if you look at the legal and lobbying arms of people like SpaceX, ULA, Blue Origin, and others, Lockheed, even Northrop Grumman, I'm sure they're much larger than Rocket Lab, but it's going to become more and more of a concern as we go. Seems like Rocket Lab, knows that and has already got a small team together there.
You think that Rocket Lab can add value or see opportunities on this space?
Well, I mentioned the Mars sample return. Mm-hmm. So this is an example of I'm not sure what the basis for some of the original projections were like $11 billion and not getting samples returned until the early 2040s. Rocket Lab has submitted a bid that is sub $4 billion and getting sample returns back in the early 2030s, right? So just completely different. So that's just a good example of where Rocket Lab is that, kind of that supplier that can be very efficient and bring innovative solutions at a much more effective cost point.
And
clearly they're not giving up on Mars sample return at all, still talking about it a lot and advocating for their own proposal, their own architecture solution.
When you think about this process has been highly profitable. When you look at these opportunities, you look at this criticality in the supply chain, you look at the value they add, like how much of a role pricing or margins play in that decision making, or how much of that margins are actually because you are able to scale up the volumes?
I think it depends on the component that you're talking about. The margin profile of our component businesses really ranges quite significantly. In the solar component is a lower margin business. We're working very hard to continue to scale that. But that is, one of the businesses is a little bit on the lower end of our kind of margin profile, where we've got other businesses within that component portfolio that is well north of 50% gross margin. So I think it is scale, and and being able
It's interesting. I didn't know that they had any component. I kind of thought 50% was like the high level for the company in terms of gross margin. I wonder what component he's talking about that's well north of 50%. Let me know if you have any ideas on that down below. Don't think it's reaction wheels, especially considering they're just scaling up to high volume. So generally, they sacrifice a little bit of margin and make up for it with higher volume. And clearly not solar. Maybe Star Trackers, something like that. Let me know what you guys think.
to, absorb some of that fixed overhead opportunity that we pursue is something that is bringing something into the company, some new capability, a new technology, or allowing us to put more investment into our factories that, going from, for instance, some of the earlier contracts that we had won were for one-off satellites or 2 satellites or 4 satellites. And then when we won our contract with MDA was to build 17 satellites. That's a completely different production environment. And that helps us then win the SDA Tranche 2 contract, which is 18 satellites, right? So we're able to leverage a lot of the technology and know-how and capabilities as we progress, right? So it's really, we win one to enable us to win the next and keep moving in that direction.
Perfect. And
I like that philosophy. It makes a ton of sense. And you're not just, winning a given contract for the sake of winning that contract and the revenue it brings, but looking a step ahead, 2 steps ahead. Seems like they're kind of playing 3D chess here.
So Flatlight is a new satellite form factor within our portfolio of satellites within the company. And so the big difference between our other satellite designs and Flatlight is it is think of like a pancake type of form factor where you can stack many more satellites in the fairing of a rocket versus, a more traditional, satellite design. And one of the more important decisions that a satellite operator is going to make in choosing like a launch provider is what is the cost to launch per satellite. And so you might have a satellite that is not all that mass constrained, but it's volume constrained. So you can imagine, if you have a rocket that can fit 7 satellites in the fairing versus now with this new architecture, you can fit 20 satellites in the fairing. Well, your cost per satellite has come, or, to launch has come down.
Interesting. Do you guys think that 20 number, is that like a firm number, or is he just kind of throwing that out there as an example, like 7 versus 20? If we do get confirmed that 20 is the number that Neutron will be able to fit, I think that is a important piece of information to make note of as well.
Once Neutron successfully launches, then once you move into production with Neutron, you see a pretty significant kind of flip in the income statement because a lot of that R&D intensity starts to reduce. A lot of the prototyping that we've been doing leading up to the first flight, that doesn't go completely away, but it comes down quite significantly. I mean, there'll continue to be investments in block upgrades of the vehicle over the first, couple of years, get, the first few flights essentially. But kind of once you get through that period, once you get the first flight off and you move into production, now all of that's more of accounting, but all of that cost to build Neutron now moves from R&D up into cost of goods sold, right? And so now you're moving that expense now with timing it with when you're actually now selling a Neutron for $50 to $55 million, right? So I mean, again, you see a huge benefit on the P&L pretty quickly after you get that first launch off. From a cash flow perspective, Again, you're going to continue seeing investments in Neutron as we continue to scale the business. But again, as you start to get to that 135 cadence, that's when you're really going to start to see the benefit of on the cash flow as well.
So some good info there in terms of profitability to keep in mind. We're going to see a lot of benefits, not so much this year with that test launch, but next year and even the year after that is when we should see, big benefits from Neutron launching, and obviously R&D budget moving over to just cost of goods sold and actually bringing in revenue based on those new products that they're building. Okay, that's pretty much it for the B of A conference. Some pretty good information there. Some stuff reiterating that we've heard before, but some pretty interesting stuff as well, particularly around Electron backlog and how they expect to see that realized, as well as some stuff around Neutron. We will now go to the final conference, which had CFO Adam Spice speaking. Okay, so now we have the KeyBank Capital Markets Emerging Technology Summit with Rocket Lab's CFO Adam Spice talking. This one was a little bit longer ago, I think like a week or two. So this was before the announced $500 million potential offering, as well as the Minaric acquisition. So just keep that in mind as you're listening to him talk about, things like capital availability and stuff like that. Let's go ahead and take a listen now.
So I think we looked at things very, very differently. I think we also have an advantage where about a third of our workforce is located in New Zealand, where the company was started. And a lot of people don't realize the cost effectiveness of doing things in New Zealand is just much, much cheaper. You can get, 2 or 3 engineers for the cost of one US-based engineer. So it's a very cost-effective place to operate. And we could also scale that in a way because...
It's an interesting point. I haven't heard them talk about too much. You can get a lot more engineers in New Zealand for the same price. I guess it makes sense. Salaries out Silicon Valley way are pretty astronomical, pun intended.
Usability of the rocket, increase margins as you scale. So just how are you thinking about margins as you launch Electron more?
Yeah, so when we started, with Electron, it was a low to negative gross margin proposition that over time got to the point where last quarter our margins for Electron were in the low 30s, so they've expanded pretty dramatically, and we think there's a path to get to mid 40s and maybe even push 50 points on the gross margin as we get to a higher cadence. So one thing that a lot of people don't appreciate about the rocket business, it's a very high fixed cost business. So the actual cost to build the rocket from a raw materials and direct labor perspective isn't all that high. We're a shot at that, doing that. If all the customers were to show up and we had no breakage between kind of manifest commitments and actual launches, then we'd certainly have an opportunity to do that this year. But I think, last year the majority of the cost for the rocket come into play is basically all the fixed costs of maintaining the factories, the launch pads. It's kind of somewhat of a standing army. So it's all about how many launches you can get off and how you can absorb those fixed costs over a greater number of units. So that's really the path to margin expansion, is going from 16 launches this year to north of 20 launches this year. That kind of gets us towards our sweet spot. And we've said that, look, we get to our target margin model of roughly 45 points of margin, when we can launch twice a month or 24 times a year. So we've got a shot at that, doing that. If all the customers were to show up and we had no breakage between kind of manifest commitments and actual launches, then we'd certainly have an opportunity to do that this year. But I think, last year we came into 2024 with 22 launches on the manifest. We launched 16, and we didn't leave any customers' payloads on the launch pad. So basically that means that we had rockets ready. Customers weren't always ready with their payloads, and so we have to factor in kind of what the breakage is going to be based on their committed manifest.
Okay, so some interesting information there. Basically talking margins, he said we have a shot at their target margin this year. If I kind of heard that correctly, the target margin being like 45% gross margin on Electron, which we know they need to launch twice a month, aka 24 launches in a year to hit. So basically what it sounds like is the manifest for this year is 24 launches. That lines up nicely with what their VP of Finance said in the previous section. So I think what we can kind of glean from these two conferences on Electron is customers signed up for today, customers signed up for this year is 24. Now, of course, will they all be ready in time? No, they never are. There's always some who get delayed. But that's a good number to go off of when you think, okay, they had 22 on the manifest last year and end up launching 16. If they have 24 on the manifest this year, and maybe customers are getting a little bit more experienced with these things and you have a bit less slippage, maybe we're talking 20 launches, maybe 21. Let me know what you think is reasonable for a launch number down below.
Engines, which is going to be probably the hardest part of the reentry and landing process, and you basically soft splash down over the water, and at that point we should be able to tell whether we could have landed it on the barge. But you don't want to land it on the barge, try to land on the barge until you're pretty comfortable that you can do it, because you don't want to damage a $50 million asset, and you don't.
Interesting point there that he said the barge is worth $50 million. Whether that's they're paying $50 million for it or it will be worth $50 million after they retrofit it for landings, I guess is up for debate. But as we look at the coming quarter, and we may see some kind of like a big expenditure in terms of how much they spent to buy this barge.
Don't want to trigger an
Estimate of how many of those could fit on a Neutron?
It really depends. Each one's going to be a little bit different. I mean, Flatlight is really, it's a design, but there'll be the iterations around that depending on the payload requirements and stuff, and how much the platform, power requirements will dictate how much solar you need and so forth. So it's going to vary, but it's certainly going to be a very, very efficient way. And I think, of course, we've also designed Flatlight to work best with Neutron, right? Flatlight certainly will be able to fly on other launch vehicles, but we're not kind of passing up the opportunity to optimize our satellite platform with our launch platform.
A little bit of different wording there than Peter. He seemed to think it would be much more difficult for Flatlight to fly on other rockets, but Adam saying that, yeah, it could fly in other rockets. So just something to keep in mind there in terms of, I guess, the two slightly different commentaries on that.
Which really goes to the longer kind of strategic view of creating an end-to-end space company where you can do everything in-house. With the ultimate goal is, yes, you'll first very likely see Flatlight be deployed for third parties, customers, whether commercial or government. But then ultimately, we hope to see these flying, Rocket Lab logos, providing our own services to customers.
Absolutely.
Okay. So keep that in mind, that most likely will be for a third-party customer first, whether that's government or commercial. So as we think about the timeline for seeing our first Flatlights, we will need to see a contract announcement for a customer buying Flatlights. And it's probably not just going to be, Rocket Lab rolls out 200 Rocket Lab Flatlights ready to go without seeing any commercial sales of it yet.
Which is, call it $10 billion TAM. The making of satellites and all the subsystems that go into that is about a $30 billion TAM. And then if you look at the applications, it's like a $300 billion TAM. So, I think that, we all see what the brass ring or a prize is at the end of this. It's not launching more rockets to deliver other people's stuff. It's not necessarily focus on making, satellites for other people. It's getting a piece of that $300 billion pie, which hopefully is going to grow pretty dramatically if you look at, some of the third-party estimates of how.
Someone tell that to Relativity Space and ULA, because I don't know if they've gotten that memo yet. Although ULA, not really Tory's fault on that. It's more the ownership with Lockheed and Boeing. But anyway, that's just funny to hear.
How big the TAM is going to be for applications. So, for us, I would hope that 3 to 5 years from now, again, you're seeing, that we've got our own infrastructure on orbit. We've developed kind of those end customer relationships. I think that, given how long it takes to develop some of those technologies and some of those customers and also acquire spectrum, it's very likely going to be through some forms of partnerships or inorganic kind of growth through acquisition or mergers.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I don't think we really have ever had a firm timeline on when their own constellation or assets will be operating, but he said here like 3 to 5 years is when he'd kind of hope to see Rocket Lab's own satellites operating in orbit and having those relationships with customers. So that's a good time frame to keep in mind as I'm circling back to my financial discounted cash flow model soon to start adding potentially some space systems revenue into the mix. And then, of course, we've heard previously that, yeah, I don't think they're just going to be somehow buying access to their own spectrum. It will likely come in the form of partnerships, mergers, or acquisitions.
I think what we think we bring to the market is right now there is no real competitor to SpaceX in the medium class launch category. It's just not, right? So Neutron, is developed it really is in a position to be the number 2 behind the Falcon 9, but we actually think it's going to be longer term a better vehicle because it's more modern. It's got more composite, construction versus stainless. We brought a lot of things into that vehicle, the fairing designs and so forth, to make it, ultimately, very reusable in a timely and cost-effective way. So when you
I know I'm biased and I'm a big fan of Rocket Lab, but I think that's pretty fair. Rocket Lab's Neutron being developed like decades after SpaceX's Falcon 9, and I know they had several different block upgrade versions of the Falcon 9, but yeah, it is more modern, so you would think that they would be able to bake in some improvements. Now, of course, the counter argument there is, you really should compare it to Starship because that's SpaceX's next-gen vehicle instead of comparing it to kind of a previous vehicle, which can be valid to some extent, but those are completely different rocket sizes and classes. So really hard to compare, apples to oranges on that one. Okay, we'll call it at that for the KeyBank conference notes. There was a lot more in all 3 of these conferences. If you're interested in checking out the full conference, I will share those links down in the description below, or you can find them on Rocket Lab's Investor Relations website. Do let me know down in the comments what you thought was the most interesting tidbit you picked up from these conferences, and let's continue the discussion there. If you did find this interesting and valuable, again, I do hope you will consider hitting that subscribe button. It would be very much appreciated, and I will see you guys in the next video. I hope you have a great day and a great rest of the week. I have an exciting interview coming up, actually, with Redwire Space very soon, so looking forward to bringing you that. Anyway, see you next time. Bye for now.